All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I know that this is going to be a new guest for some of you, and for those that have been around for about a year and a half, almost 2 years at this point, whether publicly or on the member side, because this will stay members first, then go public. Some of you may be familiar with this gentleman here, who I very, very gratefully and graciously consider a friend of, in many regards, a mentor to a degree, with regards to his wise knowledge and the range of different connections that he's been able to make. But without speaking too much on behalf of him, he was former counterintelligence for the DoD. I can say that Jeff and I have had many, many private conversations that have been nothing but fantastic and enlightening for me. And I think that it's very, very appropriate and suitable, given the both from the physical and from the metaphysical aspect of things with what's going on in the world today, that we have Jeff back on to discuss a couple of different things. So without further ado, brother, thank you so much again for coming on. And how you doing today?
I'm doing good. Doing good. I always enjoy our conversations.
Yes, and as we've been discussing before we started recording, we've very graciously on Gen Z here accumulated and cultivated a whole new crowd of individuals, many spiritual oriented, many military and mil intel oriented as well. And so, one of the things that we discussed a handful of days ago, I have some notes here that I wanted to ask you about was, I mean, I have quite a few different questions and things that we could talk about, but the first off, let's start with something a little more material, if you will. The Jeffrey Epstein alleged covert operation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
before we get, because I just want to continue the conversation we had off air, just to
sure.
clarify, to give guys, since you do have the audience you have, I don't want them looking down if they try to research me at all, I don't want them looking down the wrong places. So, as much as I don't really enjoy it, let me talk a little bit about my career. Um, and I'm because you have that audience now, I'm gonna use the buzzwords and the technical speak that they understand. So I served for a little over 24 years. My primary MOS is actually 11 Bravo 5 Victor. I started life as a trigger puller. In that time in my career, I eventually got out of the Army after my first war, and I was a cop for a while. First in corrections, then on the street as a cop. And then I got hired back full time active duty for the reserve component and something known as a counter drug task force. And that sort of began, my military intelligence career. I had some background in MI before that because I'm a former LURS guy. It's a concept that no longer exists. But then I got recruited fully for this program because I had a military background as well as a law enforcement background. And it was actually for the reserve component, but it was active duty. And in that capacity, I gained the secondary MOSs of 35 Lima and 35 Fox, so counterintelligence agent and intelligence analyst. Um, Unconventional for both those positions, but nonetheless, I got a lot of really good exposure to various kinds of human, etc. I then, got back on regular active duty again for this my second war, which was being a military advisor embedded with the Afghan National Army, what we called ETT at the time. In that capacity, I used it was for Task Force Phoenix 2. I used every single hat I could possibly wear. It was the most I've ever been used for every skill set I had in my career. Nonetheless, that's my military career. On the esoteric side, I'm a lifelong martial artist. My parent art is something called Budo Taijutsu. In the 80s, it was more often than not referred to as ninjutsu. We tend not to use that language anymore. I also have a pretty significant investment in historical European martial arts. My martial pursuits also parallel my spiritual ones because I have a fair amount of investment, training, and initiation in something called Mikkyo Buddhism, which is esoteric Buddhism. There's two variants, Tendai and Shingon. I'm a Shingon guy. I had the great fortune of being part of a Shingon Sangha. Not any good at it because my Japanese is horrible. My Sanskrit is worse. Nonetheless, I got a lot from the experience under the Reverend Jomio Tanaka, phenomenal teacher, incredibly wise, incredibly kind, etc. And I'm also a Reiki practitioner, among other things. On the Western side, I'm a, a lifelong Freemason. So I was a demon as a kid. I come from a family of Freemasons. I'm a Freemason myself and a Rosicrucian, and I belong to more than one Knight Templar body, both Masonic and non-Masonic. Along with those things, and I share that in some detail because I recognize the fact it biased my perspective. And so I know I'm seeing through a lens formed from those experiences. And that's important when we talk further because I know the phenomenon speaks to us through the lens we present. I'm also an experiencer. I've had my own experiences. I generally don't talk about them because, other than a handful of times where there was a witness or some physical event which left, uh, evidence of one kind or another, a lot of my experiences are noetic in nature, and I cannot qualify them. If you told me there was something emerging from my subconscious, well, I couldn't deny it. Anyway, so all of those together obviously has my own lifelong investment in the phenomenon.
Right.
But
And thank you, by the way.
so many people who are watching this also have their own experiences, probably have backgrounds similar to my own, are choosing not to speak, and I don't blame them because talking publicly about any of this is not my first choice.
Right. Right.
However, I'm deeply inspired by this moment in history, like so many other people are. And I have my experiences, and as we were saying before off the air, I see a lot of people misconstrue a lot of things, both about the military and intelligence community, as well as about the phenomenon in general. And I understand subjectively how that occurs, but it's just way off the mark, and it doesn't do the discourse any good because one of the reasons we've talked about before, one of the reasons I don't talk publicly is as soon as you tell someone you have an intelligence background, well, you're the bad guy.
Right.
Okay, and I'm not denying the intelligence community has done some really evil, awful shit. I'll be the first to tell you that.
Right.
But you can't condemn an entire discipline, and now literally hundreds of thousands of people
Right.
who've also done a lot of good things. There's a lot of bad things they've done you don't even know about.
Right.
There's also a lot of good things they've done you don't know about.
Right. It's like
Um,
that. If I could say very quickly, it's like that figure of speech to look at it sort of glass half full that I brought up, I think, on our last recording a year and a half ago, which was, again, a quote from the film Tenet. Nobody, I think it was, nobody cares about the bomb that never went off.
Correct.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's all, and the other thing is more than anything else, and you and I have talked about this before. One of the biggest myths I consider that is the most harmful to this whole discourse
Mm.
is the belief that there's something called the United States government. That thing does not exist.
Oh, we're speaking with regards to the way that people just place blame on the
They
government.
think
That's it.
there's a vending machine that pumps out Agent
Right.
Smith, and there's 100,000 Agent Smiths in this one big monolithic organization called the United States government. Nothing is farther from the truth. I've worked at all echelons of the government, and I can tell you more often than not, the biggest obstacle to the United States government is in fact the United States government. It's
Mm.
been a lot of the American tax dollar is spent on the government fighting the government.
So if
I
I
have
can ask very quickly with that, with this line of questioning or with this line of thought that we're going along, if there were to be, if we were to take this to a conclusion for a moment, even hypothetically, if there were to be various elements based on your experience or sub elements within whether private contracting companies or in official capacities with the Air Force or the Navy, if there were to be a UAP program, in your opinion, would it be so heavily compartmentalized that X amount of people would know, but then that's essentially it with regards to maybe a certain part of that program, and then you would kind of
absolutely. So let's go back to this monolith of the United States government. There is a loose confederation of organizations and agendas we can kind of call the United States government.
right,
And as a whole, the United States government is dumber than a box of rocks. It's an idiot. However, inside the United States government,
right,
organizations and even individuals that are absolutely brilliant.
right, right,
We have some extraordinarily talented people who are nameless and faceless, and you'll never know who they are, but they've already, any thought I can have, they've already had themselves if they're working on this particular problem set. And my conclusion is that they are.
right.
That being said, um,
So sorry, in other words, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing in many aspects.
oh, either that or as often directly fighting the right hand.
Okay, okay, got you. Okay, okay,
That being said, uh, I come to this conclusion long ago, and it makes the most sense. And this also explains why there are people I admire a lot and like who got it wrong, and
right,
this is why they got it wrong. It
right,
is because let's talk about the the the, the point of origin. the decision to conceal the phenomenon or presence of the phenomenon. Well, what people don't realize is the discussion about and plan to disclose would have begun at the same time, because the people who were in the middle of this and middle of the Cold War, which informed a lot of their thinking, would have known about a potential inevitable exposure of the phenomenon, and so they would have already started wargaming. What would be the process to get this out if we were ever going to get it out? What would that look like? What happens if it does get compromised, etc.? But
Right.
again, we're not talking about the United States government as a whole. We're talking about a subset within that government, whether there's truth to the idea that there was once a Majestic 12 or not, or whether it's Zodiac now or not. Most likely there were a group of informed individuals who were going through this kind of decision cycle.
And with that said, if we were to stretch our topic of discussion or our scope of the discussion more outward, could we say that outside of the government, for example, let's say there have been, let me try and phrase this appropriately. There are there are certain events that the phenomena is utilizing in order to turn institutions in on themselves, as we discussed the other.
Yeah, so as we talked about before, actually, first a couple things. One, so to answer your first questions that got off topic was yes, most likely the best place to hide this or to get rid of it or to try to achieve some good at. If you look at from the context they were coming from, if they were altruistic in motivation, they would have most likely come to the same conclusion. That is, do not expose the fact that we have this. Instead, get it into the private sector, one that hides it um, a lot better than having positive control over it in the government.
Right.
And two, if there's any good that to be derived from it, it would be the big brains in the private sector who would probably,
We're
you know,
also, in fairness, we're also talking about things that allegedly make nuclear bombs look like firecrackers, right?
oh,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I'm not justifying at all the continued obfuscation. What I
Oh,
am trying to
no.
put in context is where they were originally coming from in that in
And
in
how looking back it's
historical
easy
reality.
for right, and how looking back it's easy for things to have been gotten lost over the years through compartmentalizing in one company to another, etc. And again, I'm not trying to defend the MIC whatsoever, but the notion that compartments over compartments, and next thing you know there's so much obfuscation and compartmentalization that no one knows who's overseeing what anymore, and you've basically lost track of of various potential programs from the perspective of the government when trying to sort of, I guess you could say, follow up with these contractors.
Yes, and at some point there probably was oversight, and
Right.
somewhere along the way that oversight dropped off.
Right.
I don't know how or when that happened. It's that's I'm punching over my weight when I start talking about that echelon because that's an echelon I did not directly work at.
Well, now we're talking, if I could, just to be clear, and I don't mean to get all conspiratorial, but we're also talking about an echelon, arguably, that is semi-official and semi-not official.
Correct. Let's talk.
So,
This is another worthy topic we've talked about before, but it's worth talking about again.
right,
To dispel the idea of the cartoon villain deep state that people talk about because that doesn't exist, but to
right,
talk about the real career culture that does exist that you can sort of call the deep state.
right,
There is a career culture. That career culture spans generations and has significant overlap in agencies, both in the DoD, DOJ, and private sector.
mm,
And these people have been there for decades. They all know each other. It's actually a natural kind of emergent phenomenon inside an organization of that size and scope. And so, yes, there are careers who kind of can be thought of as a deep state sort of, and that does, rightfully or wrongfully overlap across industry. Again, multiple proponents of the executive branch of the government, and as well as financial interests. So
and
those
very quickly, if I could say, in addition to what you said there so eloquently, when we say deep state, could we also liken it to individuals that, for example, over the course of many decades, let's say, have become very, I don't want to say tribal oriented, but sort of like uh, uh, don't rat on each other type club.
Oh, sure, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. So loyalty and trust are high commodities.
right,
They are a form of currency, right? And so
right,
that's we can talk about subculture a little bit and how that culture happens, and it's a culture I'm a part of. I understand. I mean,
right.
trust and loyalty are everything, and in certain contexts, and certainly in the trigger puller context. I mean, one of the blessings that come out of the very dark thing that is war is you see people at their very best and very worst simultaneously.
Right.
So you're forced to accept both those truths simultaneously in someone.
And as if I could say quickly, as a field operator, I would, or a former, I would imagine that having trust is the core, like it is the bread and butter of the way you operate.
Trust is everything.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Right.
and it's good and bad. So, one of the things in this whole discussion, and this and other discussions, we need to get out of this dualistic thing of saying it's all good and only good, or it's all bad and only bad. That's not
Right.
true.
Right.
It's good and bad. So there are good things that are emerged from that way of life, that worldview, that paradigm, as well as bad things.
Right.
You see this in the military and law enforcement. I mean, when I was a cop, you start off, you sort of still have a good, worldview about your fellow human beings. After a while, you start not trusting your fellow human beings. You only trust cops. After a while, you stop trusting other cops. You only trust your partner. After a while, you no longer trust your partner, and you're having doubts about yourself. I mean,
Right.
that's how unfortunately being introduced to certain influences constantly.
Right.
And now we're getting like way off the UAP topic and start talking about
No, no,
policing
no, no.
and
This is
public
great.
community.
This speaks
But
to all of it. Don't worry. Yeah.
but these kind of inputs can really taint your perspective as well as strengthen it. So there's, like I said, there's both good and bad things, because the good part of it is there are guys I serve with who I don't talk to hardly at all. But
Right.
if I was in a crisis or emergency, I could call them, no shit, call them, and they would stop what they're doing and come to my aid, because there is a brotherhood that transcends normal mundane civilian experience. And that, I know that sounds horribly elitist. Uh, it's just true. And
I
everybody out there watching this who's ever pulled a trigger or been downrange knows exactly what I'm talking about.
right. Yeah. And I'm just to be clear for the record, I have not. So I'm not saying that I know what it's like. I'm just saying that I can
Oh,
in
yeah. I mean, and again, I know that sounds kind of elitist, and I don't mean it to. It's
no,
just
no,
the
no, no,
reality
not at no,
of
not at
of,
all.
of where we come from.
No, no, but you've been through what you've been through. That's something to, in many regards, like you said, you've experienced the best of yourself and the worst of yourself. That's not
Yes.
respectfully, I don't see that as being elitist. It's what you've done. I mean, like we said before we started recording, you've done things that a lot of people just watch movies about. So, yeah, it's. I
I'm
mean,
just a guy.
as
I was fortunate I had a career, but I'm just a guy.
right, right. Speaking of which, one thing I just wanted to sort of close off, as we discussed earlier, with regards to the Jeffrey Epstein topic. And from your coming, if you were to take both your law enforcement and your military intelligence perspective on such, why, and I know we discussed this a bit last week, but if you could say for the audience, why, in your view, would again, assuming this was, Mossad operation, as clearly the new court documents seem to very strongly indicate, why would an operation go on for so long from a human perspective? It's been theorized already that an operation like Epstein would not have been something that the entire Mossad would have been known about. This would have been highly compartmentalized, very focused. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So a couple things. I remember when we talked about it, I guess like last year sometime, and I was
Yeah,
saying, I was talking about something, and and Epstein came up, and I said, no, I don't think it's a CIA thing,
right,
for a number of reasons.
right.
And people did, well, even in the comments are like, well, that's, I like what that guy said, but he was way off on the Epstein thing. That absolutely was an Intel thing. No, it wasn't a CIA thing.
I
I
see.
don't have firsthand knowledge to say it was a Mossad thing, but I certainly could see it.
So you would say that from your experience, Mossad tends to go farther than other agencies.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that a little bit. And I'm not going to defend their actions at all, but I
Right,
will
right,
I will talk about their context. So you're talking about a nation state that, from before it began as a state,
right,
was surrounded by other states that wanted them to cease to exist. Period. Full stop. So in that environment, that context, and again, I'm not justifying Mossad. I'm saying I understand where they're coming from.
right, right.
the their version of where the line is you can't cross is way farther along than ours.
In other
It's like
words,
way out there.
Right, right. In other words, we have all this landlocking and we have all this separation of bodies of water between us and our enemies or our adversaries. Whereas, and again, I'm not justifying it either, but to look back at the lineage of the way the perspective would have been accumulated to justify it, it's basically, listen, we're part of my French, we're fucking surrounded by everyone that wants to kill us.
Yeah, that literally wants to see them cease to exist.
So would you see, for example, a potential operation where not necessarily a first where they would use Epstein as a first sort of plan of action, but as sort of a safety net or reassurance where there would be some human compromise within Europe?
Right. So
Yeah.
if it was a Mossad thing,
And I say this very, sorry, just to take it to full conclusion very quickly, the idea would be that Epstein would be compromising certain European and potentially American politicians so that whether a United Nations vote came up or a certain contract for the Pentagon for, an Israeli company came up, Epstein could use that blackmail to influence decision making.
correct.
Right.
And that's exactly, it would have been a very limited scope. I mean, to perpetuate it that long, there are human operations that go that long. It's not unheard of. Although,
Oh, sorry, there are. There are.
yeah, the
Wow.
risk is extraordinary the longer you go with it. So they would have compartmentalized that in such a way that there are multiple levels of cutout. So it'll be very hard to get back and pinpoint the finger. Say, yes, we know it was Mossad.
I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but when you say cut certain individuals out with respects to keeping it so tightly so they could keep it compartmentalized for and have it go for so long, would this be something perhaps that there's been speculation in the news. Now, to be fair, this is for-profit syndicated media that's saying this, but that Epstein, reported directly to people like Ehud Barak or Netanyahu. Would this be something you
No,
No? Okay.
no. He
Okay.
reported to a handler who may have been, what's her name? Maxwell.
Okay. Okay.
She may
And
have been the handler, and she reported to another handler whose identity will not be able to be corroborated.
got you. So
I
you
mean, that's me speculating.
Sure, sure.
That's a kind of operation I don't um, have a lot of direct experience with at that
Right.
level. Um,
Right. But for the sake of just using logic and using from your experience, you would say that there would be a couple of buffers, but in between Epstein and
correct.
okay. Okay. Got you. Got you. Very interesting. So I
So
appreciate
it'll be very hard to pin it on the side. They're
right,
really good at what they do.
right.
They
Got
absolutely, history's changed in a bunch of ways. So, obviously the attack of the 17th of October changed everything. Hamas knew it would. They were rolling the dice when they decided to do the operation they did. This also, if this gets increasing visibility and Mossad is repeatedly suspected, it could change things as well. So this is a tumultuous time for a number of reasons, not just about that issue, but about a bunch of issues, because we're in a time, and this goes back to something else we were talking about the phenomenon being contact with the phenomenon being an initiatic experience. Um, and I guess we could take that thought further and talk about how I came to some rather fantastical
please if we
conclusions.
if we'd like to transition there, please. Yeah.
Oh, sure, we can talk. Well, we can keep talking. In either one. I don't know what else there is to say about Epstein.
No,
I,
that's what I mean. If you want
I
to, yeah, that's
believe
what
that
I
it
mean.
was
Yeah.
there's a good chance it was a human
We don't
operation
need to we don't need to
executed.
rehash the details for the audience. They can look that up
Yeah,
themselves.
I
Yeah.
can,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it makes sense to me being a Mossad thing. Maybe it was, maybe not. Would the Russians do that? Maybe. Uh,
Right.
they also have like zero governor on their actions. They will just the FSB, which is just really
Oh, so
KGB
the FSB
2.0.
as well. They'll
Yeah, or not the FSB, but the SVR, but
SVR.
their external branch. At any rate, they'll stop at nothing either. Now, I don't think it was them, but that's something they certainly would. They wouldn't hesitate. Whereas, Mossad at least has a line you can't cross, even no matter how far away it is. Russian intelligence has no line whatsoever.
What
They
about
will just do whatever.
What about Russian intelligence in relation to Chinese intelligence? Do they have a line, the Chinese intel guys, or depending, I guess?
Not in the Chinese are not my area of expertise.
Gotcha.
Um, However, they aren't stupid. So
Right.
my perception of the Chinese, again, not my area of expertise, but my perception of them is, yeah, their line's a lot farther away than ours are too, but they still have one.
Right. Right.
Only because they're very conscious about blowback and about consequence.
It looks like China has a few more things to balance on the world stage than Russia does in the economic side of things. And that's
Correct.
right. Well, with that said, let's move on to a couple different other things that I wanted to discuss as well, which was, and again, if there's anything that you wanted to transition in as well that's on your mind, please feel free. But the end game force of actions, essentially, and how the phenomena is turning the institutions in on themselves in the sense of we discussed before having you control the mind for me, so to speak. If you,
Right. So,
yeah.
I'll start with a general observation and conclusions I've come to. Homo sapiens sapien has been the unwitting sorcerer's apprentice the entire time. One of the ways that I view the phenomenon is as an intelligence service, not for nefarious reasons, but in the way that it acts, its modes of operation and expected end states. Um, and so part of what's occurring is I perceive it now, and I'll be the first to tell you my perceptions have changed along the way multiple times, and I could be wrong, and I may change my mind later. But from what I've seen and experienced thus far, is that one of the end state goals of the phenomenon is to change the architecture of human consciousness. This may be because their ability to manifest in our reality may rely on the observer effect at scale. And so, if you notice, most major flaps were, mass sightings, even when the phenomenon is viewed at numbers, it's always at range. You don't have an example of a UFO landing in a football stadium where everybody's relatively close and getting out and talking to people.
Okay, so this was something from a psychological perspective, even putting the notion of the phenomena aside for a moment, the concept of someone or something, even there have been cases in the past where, you watch these documentaries about how intel agencies have been trying to capture these warlords for decades, and these warlords are close, but not close enough for the point where they can get them. It seems like the phenomenon is kind of doing that same thing where it's within distance of visibility and potential interaction, but it's not right there for you to go, okay, I know.
Right. So it's the consensus reality frame, right? And so there's
Right.
been multiple instances where witnesses in close proximity to each other experienced a different effect. They saw something different, the craft looked different, the beings looked different, etc. And that's when they were in close proximity to each other and the phenomenon. There was still a different presentation. So for the phenomenon to present at scale in mass, uh, there needs to be a change to the baseline of the consensus reality frame. Either its expansion or the injection of an archetype or even just a phenotype like the gray body plan that is now ubiquitous enough that it forms the consensus frame.
Right.
Um, and so it looks to me that the phenomenon this entire time has been working in the material, time space domain of operations we understand it, and in a domain of operation we have little access to, at least not holistically as a species, as an organization.
Sorry to interrupt you. Are the behaviors and characteristics of the phenomena in general, are they representative of, or even crudely representative of the intelligence or military intelligence form of thinking or approach to thinking?
Yeah, I mean, to frame it like that almost kind of brings baggage with it, but the intelligence paradigm is as such, and this goes to another thing we talked about why the phenomenon seems to affect and associate with certain demographics. And it's anecdotal on my part because I know I'm looking at a biased sample based on my own personal experiences and others. The phenomenon interacts with people from all walks of life without question. However, I'm beginning to suspect the phenomenon interacts with certain subsects, subsectors, or certain demographics with a certain specificity. And the thing about intelligence professionals, as well as law enforcement professionals, as well as theologians, as well as any number of people who think a certain way, one is the ability to pattern and associate, right? Two, specific to intelligence, is the ability to think on and act on multiple layers of narrative at the same time. And one of the things I suspect is the phenomenon is speaking in those multiple layers of narrative at the same time for a number of reasons. And so as I look at the trajectory of my own life, some of the people I know, and the history of intelligence professionals since before there was a United States, there are some odd associations that continue to emerge.
Could we have a couple examples of that in terms of the interesting associations?
Sure, and people can look. I mean, like if I could, reach into a magic hat and pull out other people to bring this conversation, it'd be guys like Peter Levinda, Mitch Horowitz. They could
Right,
speak to it.
right.
Dr. Basoka, so she could have a thing or two to say about it. But there. I mean, we can the stereotype, an archetype we can pull from history is John D.
Right. Yeah,
Right. So
yeah.
and the people he associated with in the Elizabethan era,
Right.
uh, who were involved in the intelligence cycle of the time for the Elizabethan government, but also had a connection to esoteric.
This
And
speaks
so
to when
we come forward to, the Babylon working Jack Parsons, and we see there another strange example of brilliant people who,
right,
who have various connections with intelligence, even though he was a rocket scientist. And then also the phenomenon.
right.
There are examples of that through history. And so there's groups of people, like you see this interweaving
I
of
see what you mean.
association.
Even for a more recent example, going up until World War II, I believe that the again, I'm saying this carefully because I could be wrong in certain aspects, but I believe the Italian mafia, the Vatican, the US, the CIA, there were certain relationships that were interweaved there in a certain regard, which I also found interesting. Something that I think Dave Brush brought up on Joe Rogan when he said that there was this connection back then because there was a UAP crash in Italy and the
Yeah,
Vatican.
1933. I forgot,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah, and the Vatican alerted the OSS.
yeah, right,
Um, yeah. So, but, and we'll talk about when we talk about the trauma to shaman effect. This produces both false positives and false negatives.
thank
People
you for bringing
dismiss
that
the
up.
associations because it seems almost cartoonish to think a bunch of spooks are also a bunch of magicians who are also talking to aliens.
Right,
It seems
right,
like a cartoonish to the point of dumb, to the point of B movie associations to make.
right.
However, I think sometimes it's true.
I that's why I laughed actually, because that's what I found in my personal experiences to be the case more often than not. It turns out that the former, field operator, now Intel, or ex-Intel person, also Freemason, also this, and it's like all these things are falling into place, and then you have to wonder, it's not necessarily about the individual, but what are and this is your field of specialty, but what are the patterns that lead up to
So
this?
let's talk
Yeah,
about how the conspiracy theorists get it wrong, and also one of the more fantastical conclusions I've come to.
right.
So where the conspiracy theorists get it wrong is they keep trying to prove and validate longitudinal chains of human culpability. Like
Mm,
there is an actual generational plan that's being executed all the time, and it's been done so for going back to the younger Dryas or whatever
right, right,
historical theory you have. That's not true. It is true in parts for certain segments of that trajectory of that timeline. So
right.
parts of the timeline you can see that culpability, but not for the whole thing. What is true is the pattern. right? And so
Right.
going back to a model we've talked about before, right? So the triad of
Sorry, can I just say very quickly what just to clarify what you're saying essentially is that the objective or agenda of king or queen, the whatever 600 years ago is not still being followed through today.
uh not as a form of direct transmission.
Right, right, right. Yes.
In other words, not me telling you, hey, tell your grandkid this plan
Right.
and
Right.
execute it.
Right, right.
What is true though is the aspiration and inspiration of that plan
Right.
is being communicated.
Right.
Um, and sometimes there's direct culpability.
Right.
Sometimes there's not. The reason being is so the triad of cosmotheological constants, right? So panentheism, not pantheism, but panentheism, emanation theology, and panpsychism, right? So that forms the inverse delta that you, me, the Greys, we all fit in there, right? So in that model, since the underneath is all one thing, that's where the pattern moves. So the pattern emerges at points in history, gets a human sock puppet to do the thing, and now it looks like there's you can connect a bunch of dots of direct culpability, but you can't.
Right. So in other
Goes
words,
back down into the underneath, comes up somewhere else, and moves that sock puppet.
right, sort of like whack-a-mole, kind of.
Sort of. So again, if we emerge from reality, so we in that model, we're all emerging from the same panpsychic stuff. So the gestalt, and so this also goes to the way the phenomenon operates. So why would the phenomenon bother to tell somebody some mystery about the nature of reality in the universe, and that person never tells another soul? Well, we ourselves are unaware of the underneath, the collected wholeness underneath. They're not, so they know that when they whisper a secret in your ear, even if you tell no one, they've still whispered that secret to the collective, and it started weighting the
Right.
reality frame.
Now, if I can that's beautifully put. Now, if I can ask you if we can shift this very slightly for a moment to the potential perspective that if the phenomena were to have this ability, which I very much believe it does, as you've been describing, is it possible from a fractal perspective and from a patterning perspective, as we zoom out, there may be a way to, and I say this carefully because I don't want to jump right away to, reptilian DNA bloodline, etc., but a way to insert within certain lineages of certain bloodlines these
Yeah, I mean, yet again, that's fantastical speculation, but one that may actually have bearing. So
right,
let's go back to one of the assumptions that I've come to. There is an unseen hand that moves through human history. There
right,
may not just be one unseen hand that moves through human history. There may be two unseen hands that move through human history. But guess what? It looks like at first glance those unseen hands are opposing each other. They're not. It's controlled opposition. They're
right,
pretending to oppose each other.
right,
And they're pretending to oppose each other because it creates the necessary stressors, environmental and evolutionary, that causes change. So
right,
let's go back to whether you think the Nordic space angels, the space elves, are good guys or bad guys, and who are they interacting with and why. So
right.
here's an ancient population I have a genetic connection to, the Scythians. They were a bunch of pot smoking raiders that terrorized the Eurasian steppe. I don't know, that's not necessarily a good thing. However,
Right.
um, they also had a significant amount of refinement and culture, um, and certain cultural characteristics which they transmitted across the
And I,
continents
Jeff,
to
brother, if
various
I could say
populations.
very quickly, you're reminding me of, from a scientific perspective, the way you induce change in a particle is you have to get it to oscillate. So it just from on a bigger scale, if you can get a populace to oscillate and unfortunately go against each other, they will begin to transmutate and change.
Correct, and also they'll spread their genes and their ideas.
Right.
Yeah, at the subjective scale, that's a horribly cruel way to spread ideas.
Yeah.
At the objective scale, if you're at the 30,000 foot level or higher, go, yeah, it's pretty awful for those individual people. But the end state down the road is we've made a smarter creature who will eventually evolve into an altruistic being. We have to go through all this evolutionary ugliness to get there, right? So if you take that perspective, like, okay, so yeah, it's pretty messy on the ground when it's executed, but the end state down the road is a smarter creature.
And this is where I
As
also this is where if I were to put myself in the shoes of some type of higher form of existence or being, particularly there's been, the talk about, topology, fractals, higher versions of ourself and what have you. I'm at a moral quandary. I really am with regards to what approach is better because it even speaks to, as someone said on the show long ago, when you go walking for a picnic, you may have stepped on a couple of bugs. You know what I mean? Like it's the same relative example. So yeah,
yeah, yeah, without question, and we can talk about that for a second, and why there are competing narratives, various space opera narratives that seem to contradict each other. Um, and why I'm not a big fan of solely being in one, hypothetical camp versus another hypothetical
right.
camp, whether you believe in the ETH or the ITH or some variation thereof. We don't understand our own sentience and the fabric of reality itself. We can't define ourselves well. So how can we possibly define angels or aliens well?
Can I ask you sort of, I don't mean to break you from your train of thought. Do you think that we should, as a pop or as a species, spend more time learning about ourselves more than anything else?
Yeah, without question. In fact, I think that's, one of the expected end states of the phenomenon is they induce that question.
Right. 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 Sorry, I didn't mean
It's
to.
like a phenomenon saying, "Hey, quit asking about who we are. Why don't you start asking who you are?"
And then it may be perhaps by knowing who you are and we are, we will know what it is.
Correct.
Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to take you away from your previous train of thought. Um, Shoot, it was regarding oh geez. I lost it for a second. Um, we were talking about the oscillation of a populace.
Right. So
Yeah.
you find an invader culture, usually
Right.
born of hardship. I mean, all those folks, where they were talking about the Norse and going to Viking, or the the Scythians or any of those peoples, they're coming from a hard place already. That builds resiliency, and their only mechanisms for survival. Once you start down a certain technological path, you're kind of stuck on it. Um, at any rate, but you spread ideas that way, right? And so let's look at the father of the Western world as we know it, Alexander
Right.
the Great. He's the real father of the West. The West is what it is because of him and because of the connections he made to the East, frankly. Um, with that comes a flood of ideas, become, other forms of migration that aren't hostile. A lot of migration is peaceful and just people moving through the pathways created through this expansionism of one kind or another.
In other words, the induction of change is what it,
Correct, and that
yeah,
change, more often than not, it's at the edge of a sword. But
right,
there's often good things that come after it, as well as bad things.
right,
Which also speaks to why, well, the phenomenon they're good guys, how come they haven't, landed on the White House lawn and cured cancer? Well, there's a number of reasons. And
right.
I'll just use two words: Sentinel Island. Now, would the Indian government intervene on Sentinel Island if there was a potential existential threat to the indigenous? Probably.
Right.
Will they intervene at any point up to that? No,
No, right.
for a number of reasons.
Right. And we don't, to be fair, we have to also consider that our line of thinking and perception of reality is such that we may not even know if and when the phenomena is acting or stepping in.
Correct. So going back
Right.
to this unseen hand and going back to one of your original questions about, and this is again, maybe anecdotal, but and I know I'm data poor. I don't know if I could talk to some of the insiders. They could give me more data to confirm or deny some of my suspicions. But there's no reason to suspect that the phenomena isn't fully cognitively aware of our decision cycle. In other words, you are a sensor for the phenomenon. If they want to see through your eyes, they can.
Right.
There's no point of friction. There's no interagency discourse that they're at least somehow aware of. And so when you look at the actions of disclosure going forward, the phenomenon through applied pressure, through
Yeah.
presence, and stimulus and response have driven the inward looking frictions that are causing our own system to start to dismantle itself.
Right. Right. And
Brilliant. It's
no,
absolutely brilliant. I mean,
it's
it's elegant to the
it's
supreme.
because it's kind of, we're seeing now a lot of situations, and I'm really not trying to get political here at all, but you'll see where I'm going to leading to with this. But we see certain for-profit syndicate media outlets basically telling us that a burger is not a burger, if you will, in certain aspects, regardless of political view. It's just certain events that are recurring. Is like, hold on a second, your eyes are seeing one thing, but this source is telling you something else, which again is interesting to me. But
Correct, but even going back to the in-range frictions that emerge from, let's take
right,
taking the image going forward. I mean, we've talked about this in the past. What are some things that naturally have to occur in the event of the Nimitz event, at least as I understand it?
right,
Okay, so when you take that kind of, and I'm not a Navy guy, we could have Sean on again to talk about the Navy, but
yes,
you talk about that kind of power projection, what you find in a aircraft carrier task force like that.
right,
That's one of the most powerful, organizations on planet Earth as far
right.
as its ability to deliver force. That thing has situational awareness 360, 24/7 all the time. That subsurface, surface, airborne, and orbital.
So then
Eyes
if
always looking on it. So when you see this little snippet from a FLIR, that's bullshit. That's like one.
right.
That's a pixel
Well,
of the data they have access to.
this is where when people, this is where I have to laugh, because I will say humbly and carefully publicly, I've been privy to certain things that I, perhaps others may not have, and it's like and I'm not saying towards you, brother, because you know better than me, but it's like no, 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 that FLIR thing is the basic of the most basic type of footage they have. They have that's why in many regards, when they say, when Hal Puthoff has said before publicly, if you want to see craft in their most ideal, form where it's not pixelated, he said any kind of quantum detector would work. Now it's interesting to see that he wouldn't elaborate as to how you can, build a quantum detector, but to your point, to say they don't have these radar or these forms of is nonsense.
Well, they certainly have the data sets. Understand that there are multiple layers of interaction and consequence that are occurring
Right,
with a flotilla like that. All the people who are exposed to the event, the phenomenon. So you've got, macro and micro effects all occurring simultaneously with some of
right.
the individuals who are part of that experience, as well as the institutions as a whole. So let's talk again about the institutional perspective. So you've got that kind of power projection, that kind of strategic implication. Uh, there's a reason, the United States is the most powerful country in the world, and that's one of them, because we got stuff like that. Um, it now is facing an unknown actor, state or non-state, that is penetrating its operating space with impunity, demonstrating severe overmatch. Okay, no one cannot take that with gravitas. You do not take that lightly at all when that
Yeah,
happens.
right.
Uh, so that's going to generate the decision cycle, the intelligence process to try to answer that gap in holding. There's no way that's not going to happen. If that did not happen, one of two things, they were told to not look further and not try to work the problem set, or they chose a position of career cowardice. And I refuse to believe that. I have faith in our combatant commands.
I think if
So
they told certain groups to not look further, it's perhaps because there was already a compartmentalized group or set of groups working on the.
correct, that I already knew an
Yeah,
answer.
yeah,
So this is what probably happened. Faced with applied pressure through presence. I mean, that's a nice sophisticated way of essentially bullying. So the phenomenon at that point was like, I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. They're like literally
right,
bullying the Navy, saying, "What are you going to do? We're here. What are you going to
right,
do?"
right.
And
right.
so that's that's
If I could
driving
say very
the
quickly, there was
situation.
a former Russian general that also claimed that during NATO exercises and other exercises in the Pacific and Atlantic, they would the UAP would come out of the water and basically troll them essentially and say like, you can't do anything.
Yeah, right. So the phenomenon
This,
is trolling the Navy, forcing agency. And
right.
so what does ONI do? Well, they use their uplines as a subscriber, and they start RFIing, for further information from the entities they have access to,
Sorry, when you say RFIing,
or
that's
request for information.
got you, got you. And when you say
It's
ONI's Office of Naval Intelligence,
correct.
okay,
And so
got you.
they would have started. I speak in that speak too much. I'll try to be
No, no,
concise.
no. Just for the odd person that may not know. Yeah,
So anyways, they would have asked for more information and referenced this, knowing that someone had to have it. The
right.
NSA had to know who this was or what they were doing.
Yeah,
Someone had to know.
someone.
And what
Yeah,
probably happened instead is they found denials or firewalls. It's either
yeah.
the higher echelon, national echelon entities they queried for further intelligence said we don't know, or he said yeah, we're not going to tell you. That
Right.
would have pissed them off. It would have pissed me off,
Yeah.
because the phenomenon is deliberately presenting a problem.
Especially if I could say if you were in an official capacity to know and you're now being told, hey, F off. I could see why that would give
Oh,
reason.
yeah, because the phenomenon is making damn sure that you have a reason to know.
And this is when you would likely file an IG complaint, as certain people have.
Well, I mean, it's when you end up in a political battle with various
Right.
entities,
Right.
and you develop your own strategy, and that strategy would include um, starting to develop your own narrative, and then allow that narrative through various channels to be made public.
This speaks to the
That's what
notion.
I would have done.
This speaks to the notion of dual use shaping operations. There are positive ones and negative ones. I think a lot of people don't notice or realize that people quite often seem to think that there's this constant shaping operation that's negatively intended for the public or for the masses.
Yeah, that's again,
But people, if sorry,
the
if I
world
could
would be a
say
simple place if there was only one.
right, right. Well, this is the thing. And so my thing is basically, I don't think people realize as well that when they're in a good mood and when they're, for example, making plans to go to the movies or to go hang out with friends, you can argue
Yeah, let's
that's
let's
a
clarify
positive.
terms.
Sure, that could we say that's a positive shaping, I don't want to say operation, but I'm just trying to give
So
context.
shaping operations can be kinetic or not kinetic.
Right,
They could occur in the physical space,
right.
where you use various
Interact with
echelons of munitions to breach a space strategically and tactically. You bomb
right,
it, you knock out its eyes and ears.
right.
You destroy its logger sites and reserves. You create the breach. Okay, that's kinetic. Non-kinetic is you shape the middle space, and right. And so when we look at
Non-kinetic would be
information
maybe
asymmetric warfare, we're talking about shaping
yeah,
that middle space. Here's
right,
the thing: I can talk about that completely exoterically, or
right,
I can use a panpsychic model and only talk about it esoterically. We're talking about the same thing.
right. So if I
Shaping
could
perception is shaping reality.
So in other words, in a negative aspect, we could say, for example, that if we took this theory to conclusion that what Epstein was doing was a negative, asymmetric, non-kinetic shaping operation.
That wasn't a shaping operation. That was a human operation.
Okay,
That was an operation, source operation. That was designed. He was himself an asset looking to compromise potential sources for exploitation, either to get information from them or to get them to make certain decisions. I'll give you an example, a very real one,
please,
that's
please.
very clearly, blatantly amateurish. In fact, the amateurish but still worked. That in and of itself depresses me to no end. The
I'm
fact
curious.
that the
I'm curious.
opposition in this, the guys who don't want disclosure,
Yeah.
are doing amateur shit and it's somehow still working. It just that pisses me off to no
Oh,
end.
I see what you're saying. Like for example, what they did to Grush's medical records.
No, not even that. I'm
Okay.
talking about the elected representatives who opposed this last bit of legislation.
Oh, the Congress individuals that. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay, they were doing so at the behest of their donors.
That was
That was that was you could sort of call that It's shaping operation to a degree, although that's not really shaping either.
Would that have been non-kinetic, right? Non-kinetic.
Right, kinetic just means you're using bullets and guns and force and
Right,
things.
right. Non-kinetic
Um,
means non-kinetic would mean internet, finances, things like that.
correct, and perception. So
Right.
I you've probably heard me say this before. You know, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics, masters talk atmospherics.
Huh. I don't know if you've said that before. I like that.
Right, and so when this is asymmetric atmospheric warfare we're experiencing right now, where people are uh, presenting and opposing various narratives
Right.
in an attempt to shape perception. Right.
Right.
So guess who's also doing that? As humans are doing it, the phenomenon is
The
doing that.
phenomena, right.
They're doing it at a much higher scale and much better than we are. Every machination we can think of from an intelligence perspective, the phenomenon does better.
Well, this is okay. So this leads me actually to the one question. I had one final one before we kind of wrap this up, which was there are many anonymous whistleblowers, and make of that to the audience as you will, who have claimed that when interacting, and in fairness, not just whistleblowers, but even eyewitness testimonies who have interacted with in what they've claimed to be up close in encounters with humanoid or bipedal beings, whether physical or non-physical is not the scope of this question, but the idea that these beings are largely whether friendly or not is not the point, but they're largely non-emotional. And I say that carefully because what I want to ask you is perhaps it's not that they're not emotional, it's just that they're so spiritually mature that it's the same way that when a kid tries to throw a little punch at you and you're a 40, 50-year-old adult, you just kind of laugh it
Yeah,
off.
it could just be they're professional.
Right, right.
So there's a lot of different ways to look at that problem. One, we can look at the archetypes presented, right? We can look at the human collective sense of archetype and then cross-reference the archetypes we see presented with the phenomenon. There's tons of them, right? But there's a few main ones we know of, right? The elves, the space elves, the greys,
There's
the
like I think you have
lizards.
like the space elves, the Jinn, the Greys, the uh,
Right. So
yeah.
there's a handful of them that we all recognize, and we can also find cognates for in our
Yes.
religions and our mythologies, right?
But what doesn't matter whether it's Middle East or North America, doesn't matter.
Correct. And so the argument is, did one influence the other, and if so, which one?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, Sort of doesn't matter in the end, right? So when we
Right.
understand time and space is not a place, time and space is a state, right? So
Right.
in a state that's nonlinear, it no longer matters which informed which. I mean, when lightning strikes, does the what point was the port of origin and what point, is the point of impact no longer matters because simultaneously occurs both spots.
Both, but neither simultaneously. Yeah.
Correct.
Right. Right.
Correct. So in that, their lack of effect, of affect in presentation could be for any number of reasons. One, when we look at, let's just take the gray. It's easier just to talk about one of them and go with that. The gray body plan, right? So the gray body plan proportionally is very similar to the sensory homunculus, right? Which is a model that demonstrates subjective self-apprehension, sensory self-apprehension, right? So we could be looking at a body plan that is an external objective projection of a subjective experience.
Right.
We could also be looking at a body plan that's simply task specific. So if you build a body, if your body's just a vehicle, you can build it for certain things. Doesn't need to do all of the organic life process. It only needs to fine motor control to operate things, big sensory platform to observe and collect data. It only needs to do certain things, so you only have to design it to do certain things. So I mean, this goes into now we're going into branches of the theory about whether they're programmable life forms, which they may be, or it could simply be that it's just a spacesuit for a consciousness.
Right. Right.
And so maybe you don't need a bunch of nonverbal gesturing, right? So I mean, we see spatial geometry is
Well, that's where it
fine.
gets interesting because that's led to the notion that there's perhaps this sort of, and I say this very crudely and carefully, but and also vaguely, but this notion of sort of how can I put it, a material versus non-material aspect of the phenomena. But there's in many cases what seem to be very clearly physical craft, and then in other cases it looks like very bright blue orbs, yellow orbs, or a mixture of colors that seem much more organic. So yeah.
Which is, and that was my own personal experience, which I probably told you about at one point. I was with an orb in close proximity in my home. Um, Very positive. I mean, and so on the one hand, for me, it was a very positive. It was, although it was anecdotal, it was like only momentary, brief, but the end effect was positive. I felt positive, still feel positive about the whole thing. To the point where it's almost, and I recognize the foolishness of my subjective perspective. I can be honest with myself and go, I realize I'm being foolish, and I'm obviously my perception is now emotionally compromised. But my feeling about the orb is so positive that it's almost hurtful to hear, people talk negatively about the orbs. However, I
Right.
can't deny that that's their experience.
Right,
My
right.
experience with the whole thing and the past, aside from my own periods of missing time, which I can't account for over the past roughly 30 years, 25 years, my experiences have all been net positive. Um, you know, but I can't account for what I don't remember. And also, I certainly would never minimize anybody else's experience, be it negative or otherwise.
Well, can I just say very quickly, I think this is also why, and I don't mean to say this is the reason you've had these experiences, but it speaks to the notion that you're able to, and I say this with a certain amount of disdain to a lot of the populace out there in terms of the way that there's this lack of maturity to absorb, think, take the time to analyze. A lot of people seem to have an experience and immediately they want to jump on their phone and they want to tell people and this and that. It seems that for someone like yourself to experience these things, if the phenomenon were to have a choice, they would prefer individuals like yourselves, like people that are maybe not even necessarily military intel, but people that are more that take time to think and self-reflect and analyze and not
But
impulse.
multiple layers of narrative. Yeah, I
Right,
seriously don't think phenomena is like going through an index of all of our three-letter agencies going, let's get all the spooks. The phenomenon is probably looking for a certain kind of consciousness that thinks a
right,
certain way.
right,
If that's true, like I said, the phenomenon has interacted with all people from all walks of life. So it would be a false positive, and certainly probably a product of my selection bias to say that I'm looking at intel people and that's who the phenomenon speaks to. Therefore, that's who the phenomenon speaks to, when actually they speak to all people from all walks of life. I just think there may be a specificity in application. I don't know that. I'm not exactly sure of that. I just suspect that may be true.
right.
Um,
But isn't that, if I may say, isn't I say this half jokingly, but isn't that what intelligence decisions ultimately come down to? I mean, it's nothing's ever fully certain, right? So it comes down to intuition to varying degrees.
Without question. I mean, without question, it comes down when you do, you know, when you're trying to put together an organizational Venn diagram, or you're looking at a time scale, you're like looking for functional nodes, right?
Yeah,
There's functional nodes. Without question, there's a point where that analyst must jump to intuition.
it reminds me
They
of,
may never admit that. There may be
right,
analysts who will never admit that, and they'll go through a,
right.
a criticality uh, formula, which is why they came to their conclusion. But whether they admit to it or not, intuition plays a big part.
Well, I'm reminded of the scene from Zero Dark 30. I'm not sure if you've seen it with James Gandolfini playing the head of the CIA, and they're at the table there deciding should they go after bin Laden or not, in terms of what was the proper likelihood that he was in that compound in Pakistan. And so you had some guys go 40%. Another guy said, "Well, I'm more 80%. Their OPSEC is what convinces me."
We rate our confidence, right? So,
Right,
I don't bother in conversations like this, but if I wanted to, I could rate my rate my assessment with confidence levels based on my
right,
sources
right.
that are non-contiguous, non-circular reporting, and usually from multiple collection platforms, right? If I were going to do that, we were having that kind of discussion, those would be the kinds of things I would talk about. By the way, going back to the Nimitz incident, those are the kinds of things they all did. They would have they would have needed to come up with the two basic things that they don't get talked about enough: capabilities and intentions. People have talked about capabilities and like, oh, we were looking at capabilities for exploitation. No, somebody was looking at intentions, whether you admit it or not. Somebody was, and no one's talking about it. And if their people were out there asking the right questions, and by the way, I'm talking about, I'm not going to name them, but personalities in this who I consider the white hats, the good guys. I would put these hard questions to them, knowing they can't answer, knowing they can't say, I can't
Right.
talk to that, but because the public needs to hear them say that they
In
cannot
order,
talk
you're
to that.
saying in order to stimulate the thought process of the public.
Correct.
Right. Right.
Someone needs to hear that, someone needs to be put on the spot and say, okay, you guys are looking at capabilities. Who was looking at their intentions and what was the assessment? Someone needs to ask that very specific question
Right.
because it's not intelligence unless you're also doing intentions.
Can I say thank you so much I really want to thank you for emphasizing that, because as we begin to slowly wrap up this recording, I can't emphasize that enough with regards to the audience. And I think it's something that people need to hear more often, which is there's a lot of aspects that, and I'm not perfect myself, but there's a lot of aspects in forms and ways of thinking that the mass populace doesn't seem to be aware of.
Right. And so look, I mean, from my perspective, if there's not a secret analytical program looking at this, I'm going to be
Right.
pissed off. I'm like, someone's not doing their job. Someone needs to
Right.
be fired. Lots
Right.
of people need to be fired, in fact. So I have confidence that there are pockets of analytical nodes in there somewhere at various echelons working through this problem set, and they would have absolutely tried to determine intentions. And so going back to the Navy, so they would have needed to, as best they could with unknown configurations and an unknown actor, try to determine composition, disposition, and strength in an effort to decipher capabilities and intentions. So they would have cross-referenced their own configuration, their own location, their own activity, and probably then cross-referenced major population centers, other significant key terrain. Once they've done that, they would have tried to figure out, okay, what were they looking at when they came here looking at us? And they would have tried to replicate that, and they would have used that to develop a trace back to a point of embarkation, a point of origin of some kind. So again, going back to the phenomenon creating a picture that you must act on. So whether or not the phenomenon has maritime bases of operation subservice, which they probably do, it doesn't matter what the actual truth is. The point was the phenomenon wanted you to know that because the
Right.
implied threat is obvious. The implied threat is this: there are significant points of embarkation off both coasts, very near major population centers. So at a point in time and space of their choosing, the phenomenon can present in mass at scale, can expose for even a limited duration of time over a major population center, just long enough to create the cascade communication effect across media platforms. And once they do that, if the United States government continues on its current course of action, which is to obscure, if they have said nothing prior to that event, once that event happens, the legitimacy of the United States government is over and it will never come back.
Right.
That's why, as a pro-government guy, we need to get in front of this, and there needs to be a dialogue of communication because they don't even have to be a threat. They don't have to do anything but just show up and just be there for like 3 minutes, long enough to get captured on multiple media sources. Once that happens, if our government has been silent, it's over. The social contract is gone. There won't be riots the next day. The society won't collapse. Instead, it will rot.
I see what you mean. It'll just be a slow disintegration, kind of like just a
Correct.
right, right.
So the United States government only has a few choices of varying degrees of right.
Got you.
And
Right.
it's about talking. It's about communicating. If they don't get in front of this, and I'm not the only guy to come to this
But
conclusion.
does this also speak to, and I wanted to ask you because I know Edward Teller, again, head of the Atomic Energy Commission many decades ago, but in the 1980s, he was on the I don't know if you remember the William Buckley show, and he brought up that he was very frustrated that there was this, and this was in the 80s, by the way, this he what he called sense of need for overclassification within the West, to overclassify things, whether it's information that could be found nowadays on the web.
I've experienced it firsthand. I could tell you war stories. I won't waste our time, but I've experienced it firsthand where I had an absolute need to know. Looking for HVTs, I absolutely had a need to know, and because I was looking them in the face, right, as
Right.
they're trying to
Gee,
puck these guys, apprehend them,
geez.
and because
Yeah.
of over compartmentalization, I was denied that.
Wow. So you've experienced it firsthand. You know it's real.
Yes.
You know, got you. Got you. Well, brother, with that said, I wanted to see if there's anything else you wanted to say before we wrap this up. I think it's been a really great, incredible conversation, and we're just crossing the 1 hour point. And I think there's a lot we've touched on here to leave everyone with to think on. But I'd love to give you the last word if you'd like to say anything. Um,
No, I think it's worthwhile. I'll just say this from where I'm at, based on my own personal experiences, we must one to walk the path of disclosure, and we must learn to walk at strange angles, right? So convenient, easy hypotheses are probably incorrect. Two, uh, my belief and perception is this: with discernment, we should never surrender discernment. But my perception of the phenomenon at this point, even with the trickster element, we could go on as to how and why the trickster element works and how we do the trickster element all the time ourselves. Just in the act of teaching, we use the trickster element.
right. Yeah.
That being said, that even though we should never fully surrender our discernment, but my perception of phenomena at this point is net positive
Right. I'm
for
with.
what I know at this point, and
uh,
that's not excluding, because I would never want to minimize the suffering that people have been through and the things that have been experienced. Um, and I know, and again, I know I'm data poor. I know I could maybe talk to the David Grushes of the world, and they would share with me, hey, this is what we saw. Not all it's all warm and fuzzy like you think it is, and I don't think it's warm and fuzzy. But I've yet to hear of an exchange between us and the phenomenon where we maybe got hurt, where we didn't initiate the action. The exception to that is what's going on in South America. And I don't have an answer. I don't.
Well, this then
That's
speaks
an
to, and
unknown.
perhaps this is something we could touch on in another recording, but this with Sean, but this speaks to potential, different sources of the phenomena, if you will, right? And that's,
Correct, and also
yeah,
even if the same source,
right.
different the phenomena is using different NPCs at different times for different effects.
Right, exactly, exactly. And with that said, if it's all right, I'd love to leave that there because I'm sure the people that are not non-military are probably going nuts with regards to all the things we touched upon and the complexities of it throughout this recording, which I appreciate extensively. So without further ado, everyone, if you could, brother, if you could stay on after we stop the recording, but to everyone else, I want to thank you all so very much for tuning in. This has been a great conversation. This has been the highlight of my week to have a conversation with Jeff here about this stuff. And thank you so much, Jeff, again for coming on, brother.
Yeah, sure.